In 1921, there was a young couple named David and Svea Flood, S-V-E-A. They had a 2-year-old son, and they went from Sweden to Africa, into the heart of Africa. They met up with another mission couple named the Ericsons, and together they sought God's direction. They left the mission station they were at, and they went out into the Belgian Congo, into the very bush area. They found a village, an isolated village out there, and they decided they were going to minister to that village. Well, the chief in that village did not want to allow them in the village, but he did allow them a half-mile away from the village where they built mud huts up on a slope. The only contact they had with that village was with a little African boy that was allowed by the chief to go out there and to sell them chickens and eggs. Well, Svea Flood, 4'8" lady, if that's the only African that I can talk to, that I can have any contact with, I'm going to share Jesus with this young boy. And she did that, and she eventually led this young boy to Christ. They had no other spiritual breakthroughs come for them. Malaria began to hit different groups, and the Ericsons decided they were leaving and going back to the mission station. Svea Flood got pregnant, and after a bout of malaria and having the baby, she died 17 days later. David Flood, something just snapped in him. He dug a grave, buried his wife at 27 years of age, and then he walked down that mountain back to the mission station, found the Ericsons, gave them over his brand new daughter, and said this. He said, "I'm going back to Sweden. God has ruined my life." Well, 8 months later, the Ericsons got sick again, and within days of each other, they died. And the baby daughter, was turned over to American missionaries. They called her Aggie, brought her back to the U.S. at the age of 3. When they considered returning to Africa, they felt like there would be legal problems with having her, and they loved her so desperately. They stayed in the States and pastored in South Dakota. Aggie grew up and attended North Central Bible College and married a man named Dewey Hurst. They entered ministry together, and Dewey eventually became president of a Christian college in Seattle. Now, one day, a Swedish magazine ended up in their mailbox. Aggie took this magazine and began to look through it. She couldn't read the words because they were in Swedish, but she was looking at the pictures, and she came to one page that just stopped her attention. On this page, there was a picture of a grave with a white cross in a primitive setting that had the words Svea Flood across it. She ran down to the college, found a faculty member that could read Swedish, and asked him to interpret the story. And he said the story said this: it's the story of missionaries who long ago came to the Belgian Congo, the birth of a white baby, the death of a young mother, and one little African boy that was led to Christ. It says the boy grew up. The boy asked the chief, persuaded the chief to let him build a school in the village. And he one by one, he won the children to Christ. And then the children won their parents to Christ, and eventually the chief himself came to Christ. And the story was about today 600 believers in one village, attributed to the sacrifice of David and Svea Flood. Now that's not the end of the story. That's a neat way to end it, but it goes on. Aggie and her husband, Dewey, took their 25th wedding anniversary trip to Sweden. And while she was there, she sought out her father, David. She found him. 73-year-old man, remarried with 4 children, an alcoholic who had just suffered a recent stroke and was still very, very bitter at God. In fact, in meeting with the other children, they told her, he has one rule in our house: never mention the name of God, because God took everything from me. Well, she found his apartment littered with squalor, littered with bottles, empty bottles, and she found in a rumpled bed this 73-year-old man. She went in there and she said, Papa. And he turned around and tears filled his eyes, and he says, "I never meant to give you away." And Aggie said, "It's okay, Dad. God took care of me." And his face changed. He said, God forgot us all. Our lives are like this because of God." And he turned his face back to the wall. Well, Aggie shared with him the story that had come out of the magazine. And she said, "Mama didn't die in vain, Papa. That little boy grew up and won an entire village to Jesus Christ. The one seed that was planted grew and kept growing. And Papa, Jesus loves you, and he's never hated you." And that afternoon, David Flood came back to God And within weeks, he had gone on into eternity because of the effects of the stroke. Now, that's not the end of the story either, because a few years later, they went to London, England, and they attended a evangelistic conference in London, England. A report given from the nation of, which the nation of Zaire is the new name for the Belgian Congo. The superintendent of the National Church, representing 110,000 believers, gave that report. Aggie went up to him afterwards and asked him this question: "Have you ever heard of David and Sri Flood?" He said, "Yes, ma'am, I have. It was Sri Flood who led me to Jesus Christ. I was the boy who brought food to your parents. And to this day, your mother's grave and her memory are honored by all of us. You must come because your mother is the most famous person in our history." And she went, and when she arrived in Zaire, she arrived in that village to cheering throngs of villagers. And she met a man who carried, the very man who carried her down as a baby down that mountain. She was escorted to see her mother's grave. She knelt in the soil and gave thanks for a life wasted. A life that wasn't wasted. A short-lived life. Whenever you live life at any length of time for God, it always has eternal rewards. Compare that to the father who lived 73 years, bitter at God, angry at God, and wasted his life. And what are you doing today? Are you living for God? Are you making eternal rewards? Or for whatever reason that has made you with an attitude toward God or toward the things of God, are you wasting year after year, decade after decade, and not living for God?